Thanks. I just had a two-finger on, Ling raised a number of excellent points as usual. But I wanted to, she reminded me of one that I hadn't thought of, but that I think is also really, really important in answering this question. And that is, when you've got a student who is on the eve of going into the field and doing their research, they write a prospectus, the committee signs off on it, and it's basically a contract between the student and their committee that they're going to do X, Y, and Z. And the expectation among the committee is that there's probably going to be a huge, or at least a palpable change in what they actually end up doing. Because usually when you get into the field, you realize you're asking the wrong questions, or you're looking at things the wrong way, or you haven't taken into account something that's actually driving what you're looking at. When I was in the field, my causal arrows reversed themselves. So the problem here, of course, is that if you're taking that component out of that fieldwork component out of serious research, you're far more likely to come up with something that is inaccurate and something that's based on existing priors or biases or expectations. And so in a sense, we're I don't want to come off too strongly, but we end up kind of deluding ourselves as to what is actually going on there.
That's such an important point, Andy, that we find what we're looking for unless you're sometimes confronted with, oh, things aren't actually quite the way you thought. It's much harder to revise one's intuitions. And I think this is true about using documents and speeches too. From my experience, even this past summer going to China, oftentimes it's really, I found it very helpful to understand how folks inside China were interpreting the same data or speeches that we can have access to, because it colors what you take away from those same documents. Okay, so we have time for, I think, a last round before we turn to your questions from the audience. So for each of you, if you could recommend one change in either institutional policies or in newsroom priorities or in scholarly training that would most improve the global conversation about China, what would it be? First, anybody want to start? Otherwise, we can go down the line. Lee, would you like to begin?
I think Ling touch upon this already. I hope media organization could hire more Chinese, China-born reporters to cover China. It's because I'm from that background. It's just very important to be able to read, to interact with source material, with people. It's just more natural, especially in this period that Chinese people are so scared of speaking to journalists, and it's just like one less barrier it's I don't know how people are going to interpret how I say this, but it just make people at ease, more easier to make people at ease, and also it's the background. Even for me, like my generation and like the younger generation of Chinese, like the knowledge of where China came from is already, I found like many young Chinese, they don't really know what they don't remember what happened in China at that time, even like 10, 15 years ago, when I was covering China tech. And what happened then, it's like, I have to remind them, like when I have conversations with them, I have to remind them, this has happened before. And this had, this is where things, it's quite difficult for Chinese who grew up in that environment to remember, to understand everything. It's just like, I think language is very, very important. It's to be able to read all the documents. I'm not saying like, people like Jessica or Andy, it's like there are many people who speak like perfect Chinese who can do it, but I just think we need more Chinese China-born journalists to cover China. Of course, there are a lot of barriers. It's like intimidation from the government, like you have family members there and all those things. It's very tough, but I really see news organizations benefiting from that.
I would like to say to both the US and China's governments to let the journalists in. Do not use visas as a weapon against journalism, against getting to know these countries, getting to report on them. I think that in the long run, even though they are worried about their image and how they'll be portrayed, I think in the long run it does the government's good as well to have accurate, fair, balanced journalism out there from both sides. So we as the OPC and other journalism organizations have very much come out against this visa proposal, and the Chinese government actually has come out against it as well. They don't, they in the back and forth with the US government over visas. But I think just letting journalists into these countries, looking at their visas the way they used to, obviously appropriately evaluating their ability, and their news organizations backing of them, but let them in. Thank you.
Well, I have one relatively limited change proposed because I think in the short run, large scale of scholarly exchange between US and China may be difficult. But one limited change I want to propose is to require or recommend students read news and articles published in both US and China and compare the reports on the same matter. There are plenty of examples of how do we understand China's parade from abroad and from domestically. How do we understand that China's T visa and what we just opened up a K visa, right? So all these things, on the same matter, it's important to compare the foreign and domestic perspective. And some people may say, well, this required language training to understand Chinese. If learning Chinese is not plausible in the short term for some of the students, they can simply rely on AI translation, right? AI gets better and better nowadays anyway. So I think even though the translation would not be exactly accurate, it still helps with the matter. And I think this change is doable.
Thank you. I guess if there was just one thing, it would be a pretty big thing. It's a kind of a normative change, but I think we need to embrace the notion that we're always better off with more knowledge than with less. And that's whether we see China as a misunderstood ally or as a direct existential threat. In either case, in knowledge generation, I think we should consider mitigating risk ex post more than on the overwhelming tendency to do it ex ante. When it comes to scholars, journalists, and others who genuinely engage with China in these times, I think what we should do is verify or trust. That would be my suggestion.
Fantastic. Thank you all for those opening remarks. Now we'll turn to the audience for your questions. Please, if you can, there's a microphone, yes, in the middle. Oh no, passing mics. Okay. So here I saw firsthand. User, would you please briefly identify yourself? Yes, briefly identify yourself. And then direct your question to whoever you like.
Thank you. So my name is Joran Lei, fourth year PhD at SAIS and someone who take pride of doing fieldwork in China. So I have two questions. First one is, how do you address the lack of institutional support for both academia and I guess journalists as well from the American side, and the lack of commitment to send students or researchers or journalists to China? And second is one question that I was confronted when demonstrating my research to people more in the policy world about local China or more grassroots China. Their first reaction is, why do we care? So how do we address this question of generating knowledge about, let's say, government policy making at a rural Chinese town to the greater audience and tell them it is really important? Thank you.
Take that.
Okay, thanks, Lee. Let me address your second question, which is, I think, very challenging question. Because nowadays, the focus on China, to the extent that you're doing research, is the general audience interest is less and less on what happened in this Chinese village. How do I understand the normal people's life in this rural China village? It's more about, to the extent matter, how does it matter for my taste or for the US audience interest? And again, that a lot of folks are on the, what Lee has mentioned, the geopolitical geopolitical reasoning or geopolitical content. So I acknowledge that I do not have perfect solution about on the question you raised, but perhaps if when you are doing a research, let's see in this China village or China locality, what important is like what are the theoretical implications that you can derive from that, and that may be from a very small town or village. Probably there can generate a bigger theoretical implication and message that you then you can talk to the broader audience and to make them interested. I don't know if this helps at all. And
Thanks, Ling. So I just on the lack of institutional support on the US side, I mean, what I would say is that things are so much in churn right now that it's very difficult. We haven't reached a point where we can kind of take stock and see where, where we are and what we can do, and how we can kind of map up to the Chinese side. There's all sorts of kind of long-standing institutional challenges, but right now we're really in the epicenter of something that is unprecedented, and it unfortunately the timing couldn't be worse for students who want to do research on the field in the field in China. So I mean, my generic answer to that would be to kind of stay within the bounds of what we are required to do, but to be innovative and entrepreneurial kind of within those bounds. To answer the second question, I'll take a different tack from what Ling just did, and think about. I can just think of an example that I think could kind of push back on that "why should I care" question. So China and Ghana in the mid-aughts came to diplomatic blows following riots where people were killed in Ghana. This resulted from the fact that one county in China, in Guangxi province or the Guangxi Zhuang autonomous region, started sending its people to Ghana to undertake what was called galamsey, which is the illegal mining for gold, using things like mercury and kind of undercutting the local Ghanaian gold economy. This is something that was not one of Beijing's foreign policy initiatives. It was something that was generated at the county level. And nonetheless, it put Beijing's relations with Ghana onto a really kind of relatively insecure footing. So domestic politics in China increasingly matter. And I think that's another thing that we should, as a China comparativist, I look at domestic politics, and so international relations have largely been kind of off limits for me. As China extends internationally, and as as it has under Xi Jinping, all of a sudden the pathologies that we've learned about Chinese domestic politics also get exported abroad. And therefore, it's really important for us, particularly in this time, I think, to understand what's going on domestically.
Great, thanks so much. We have another question way in the back, the lady here. Yes.